Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our loud presentation. My name is Genie Montalvo. I am the treasurer for the AES New York section, and I have with me Stephanie Lebow, who was the mix engineer on this project. She is a Peabody award-winning sound designer and engineer based in New York City. Her experience with vivid narrative audio, music, video, and radio production has given her a unique ear for audio storytelling. As the supervising senior engineer at Futuro Media and Futuro Studios, she has worked on projects such as Latino USA, Loud, the History of Reggaeton, Suave, Norco 80, La Brega, In the Thick, Translash, Anything for Selena, Brown Love, and the Battle of 187. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jeannie. I'm so happy to be here.
Cool. I'm sorry about the technical glitches there, everyone. But we are excited to get started. Um, so if you haven't seen the Loud podcast, or listen to it, actually, rather, it's a podcast. Loud is the true story of the young people from Jamaica, Panama, and Puerto Rico who beat the odds, refused to be quiet, and created an irresistible musical culture that has kept the world dancing. It's narrated by Evie Queen, who is one of the founders of the genre, and it's an incredible musical story about sex, race, drugs, censorship, and of course, perreo. This project was a partnership between Spotify and Futuro Studios. And it's been a labor of love for the past couple of years for myself. So I'm just going to kind of jump in. Basically, the project started as an idea, and we spoke to Spotify. It was kind of like a joint. We both had the same idea, and so we decided to work together on it. We worked on a pilot in late 2019 into the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic. And the idea was to tell the story in a way that it hasn't been told before. It's kind of similar to hip hop, that it's a movement that started in the streets by young kids who were just trying to speak out against oppression and the things they were dealing with. And it hadn't been told before. So we wanted to set the record straight and give the people the flowers that needed to get their flowers. So I came in at the beginning with our executive producer slash VP of original content at Futuro. To work on the project at the beginning, just everything. The way we kind of divvied up our roles at that point was just me line producing, traveling to Puerto Rico to do interviews, and then after that, cutting up the audio, assembling, and sound designing the pilot, which was a very big undertaking because the pilot basically had to set the scene and get approved at Spotify. And once that got done, we got a bigger team, and it's a 10-episode podcast that you can hear on Spotify. And the idea is that it's kind of an immersive podcast. There's lots of sound effects, there's lots of sound design, and we kind of used music to drive the story forward so that you could kind of feel what was happening in the time and kind of be immersed in the moment. So my job after the pilot was I had a baby in the middle of it, so I ended up coming back to just sound design the 10 episodes, as well as kind of help produce and keep everybody honest. But yeah, it's a sound design for the 10 episodes, and we basically created a kind of assembly line. As I mentioned in Stephanie's bio, Stephanie is the engineer at Futuro, so once that I was done with the sound design, it went off to Stephanie, and any kind of notes and things that would be implemented or changes that needed to happen would go to Stephanie. And I'll let you talk about what your role was, Stephanie.
Thanks, Jeannie. So I worked with Jeannie and the team to help finalize and content lock the episodes before diving into the mix. And during the mix phase, there were multiple rounds of notes from the team. While I mixed, I worked on polishing the pacing, sound design, denoising, all of the voices. I use Isotope RX, which I love. And then once the final mix was wrapped up, I worked with the team to finalize everything for release and prepare all the sessions for archival.
Which, working with a big, hefty company like Spotify was actually quite involved. And so we'll get to that later. So some of the things that we like to that we want to talk about in this podcast that was a little bit different from maybe some other podcasts that you might hear is that music and sound design was a very important part of this podcast, where a lot of times you think about music and scoring as kind of like background to kind of just to give you kind of ambiance. In this specific podcast, music was part of the story, and music was kind of, we like to say that it was a character in the story, so that we wanted to make sure that you were feeling the moments and also that we stayed true to the moments in time. So the music, as you progress through the podcast, the music that you hear changes as the genre was changing from the late 80s, early 90s into what you hear today. And if you're not familiar with reggaeton music, it's everywhere. I mean, Madonna has popped on dembow beats, and I'll break down what dembow is in a moment. But basically, it's the beat that now every pop star is now doing songs to reggaeton beats. Maybe you're familiar with Despacito, which kind of was a global phenomena a couple of years back. If you're not, feel free to look it up. I'm not gonna play it for everyone now. So what do I mean by the music being kind of a character? I'm just gonna jump into a session here and play you a little bit of the intro. What we have here is the intro to episode 1, and music was really important here because finding the right scene to open the podcast was important, because it had to grab everybody listening from the get-go. So I'm gonna play the first couple of minutes, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about the sound design and the music that I chose to kind of drive this moment.
Okay, picture this. It's 1995, and I'm about to have the most important audition of my life. An audition to rap with the hottest underground crew in San Juan. It was the moment that I was going to decide if I was gonna make it in the music or go back to my hometown as a nobody. So I show up at the spot. It's at DJ Negro's place, his home studio. When I walk in, all the guys are there in La Marquesina, and all of them are staring at me. And one of them call out, "¿Quién es esa mamabicha? Who the fuck is that?" I am dressed all baggy like a boy, me, pantalones ancho. That was my style back then. There are clouds of weed smoke. I see somebody leaving the studio looking kind of embarrassed. Yo sé que if I fuck up, DJ Negro will get on this big megaphone and scream, "Fuera!" Y si la caga, te tienes que ir. So it's my turn. Ay, Dios mío, DJ Negro is at the consola. And he's like, "Show me what you got." Me pongo los headphones. I'm nervous as hell. But I'm not trying to show it, So I do something kind of crazy. I turn my microphone around, turn my back towards Negro, and face the wall. I just let it loose. Muchos quieren tumbarme y le digo, mira, no, que no van a poder. Si cuando canto la gente sabe que llegó la y la nena del reggae. Cuando terminé, I turned around. I'm not sure how I did. DJ Negro looked at me straight in the eye, con una cara bien serio, and say, "Felicitaciones. Congratulations. You're in."
Cool. So there's a lot of things going on there. So a lot of things that I like to do when I score, and in this case, keeping as a character, is I do a lot of creative editing with the music. So if you notice when she was speaking, there was a point where the beat drops. And so having the music do something as they're speaking helps kind of drive the narrative forward, because you're not, again, like I said, it's not just music in the background that's filler, as opposed to like the music actually saying something. So like right here,
an audition to rap with the hottest underground crew in San Juan. It was the moment.
And giving the music a window for the beat to kind of be like, oh, okay, something is about to happen here. And a lot of times that takes like, being creative. You'll see here this fade here. I had to stretch the intro a little bit so that I could have the beat actually drop where I wanted it to drop. Other things that are happening here in the beginning is like once the music kind of fades out, just to kind of, if you think about those moments where you have to do something that's super nerve-wracking, she was super nerve-wracked, it's super stressed to do this audition, and so you have the music kind of die out, and then all of a sudden there's silence, which, silence can be more stressful and scary than having actual sound. So we have that moment kind of come out. You start hearing a heartbeat, you start hearing her breathing through the moment, through the nerves, the microphone sounds, the headphone sounds, as we kind of set through the scene, so that you can feel like when she actually starts belting it out, the moment of her audition is super important, and you're able to kind of feel that with her. The other thing that you may have heard here at the beginning is our cassette sound.
It's 1994.
That cassette sound effect will follow us through the entire series. The way this movement started was people passing around cassette tapes and making mixtapes in Puerto Rico originally. The beginning in Panama, and then throughout Puerto Rico, and then once cassettes died, whatever, they were not passing around cassettes anymore. But because I grew up with that mentality of how that happened, it was very important that this podcast kind of kept that realism to it. So the cassette sound kind of stamps the podcast as we go. It's in the billboard when we start, when we slate the podcast of what you're listening to, there's a cassette that starts and stops the episode and tells you where you're going. Or if we're like turning a page in the podcast for the story, we use a cassette. So cassette sounds are kind of like were the sort of branding, I guess, of the podcast as we went. Let's see, Stephanie, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sound design you did in episode 2. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, let me screen share. 1 second. Wanted to really immerse the audience in each scene, but especially at the top of every episode. Here's an example that I had a lot of fun working on, the top of episode 2. So at this point in the story, one of our characters is leaving behind his life in Panama to move to New York City. And in this scene, he's on the plane landing in New York and thinking about leaving that part of his life behind. We wanted the listener to be on that plane with him.
In Panama, they were hot. Their music was playing on the buses and in the club. Up in the air, Franquito imagined he's leaving all that behind. The parties, the attention, the chance to be an artist. It was time to get serious, get a real profession.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to JFK. The local time is 7:52 a.m. and the temperature is 62 degrees.
New York was a whole new ritmo de vida para Franquito. The hustle and bustle, the don't give a fuck attitude, tú sabes. In New York City, you got to be on your game.
So in this section with the memory of the club and the music at the club, there's processing printed on the music coming from the club to make it sound more authentic. So the bass is boosted, and I used reverb to fade it away as the VO mentions him leaving it all behind.
It was time to...
And this transitions into the perspective of an airplane cabin interior landing and pulling into the gate with the flight attendant welcoming him to New York. And that's me as the flight attendant. I made sure to record myself super close to the mic to add in those plosives that you hear from a flight attendant on a plane into the recording. And then I used distortion, EQ, reverb, and mixed it off to the side and kind of in the background.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to JFK. The local time is 7:52 a.m. and the temperature is 62 degrees. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to JFK. The local time is 7:52 a.m. and the temperature is 62 degrees.
Was a whole new ritmo de vida para Franquito.
Then after the plane lands, we transition to a New York City scene with layers of exterior NYC street noise, cars, sirens. So the sound design really brings you on that journey with him.
Temperature is 62 degrees.
New York was a whole new ritmo de vida para Franquito. The hustle and bustle, the don't give a fuck attitude, tú sabes. In New York City, you got to be on your game.
So that was an example of a scene that I had a lot of fun working on the sound design for. One thing that was fun about this project is we had to recreate a lot of sound design. So almost everyone on the team lent their voices at some point to kind of be a part of the Foley of the show. And Genie, I know that there are a few. I think the breathing in the intro that you just showed, that was you, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm a great breather. Yeah, no, it's exactly what Stephanie said. It's also, I mean, you know, a lot of times in public radio, you're able to claim fair use, and we can use sound effects and or clips and music and things without really having to worry about licensing. But this project was completely the opposite. Everything had to be fully licensed. Sound effects, we couldn't use anything that we didn't have rights to. So that led to a lot of creativity in terms of recreating certain moments, or, you know, like the flight attendant. Like, I think Stephanie did the flight attendant to New York. I did a flight attendant in Welcome to Miami International Airport in one of the later episodes. So like there was a lot of, we had to be creative, because otherwise, you know, then a lot of these things would have fallen flat. And it was really important to kind of immerse the audience in the moments that you're hearing about. So for instance, I mean, there was also a lot of, we went out and recorded, like some of the New York sounds, you know, I just went out and recorded the subway. Like, you know, we're privy to live in a city that lends itself to that. But we also had a producer who lives in Medellin, Colombia, and so he went out and recorded a bunch of the train sounds there, because some of the later episodes, there's a resurgence in Colombia, and so he went out and did that, and went out at like 5:45 a.m. and recorded some birds that were super important to him. And something that you actually have to think about, which is the reason I told him that he should go out and record the birds, is because I was working on a project previously where I was told that someone used just a free sound effect of a bird in an episode, and somebody wrote an email in saying that that bird was not native to the area that they were doing the episode about. So that's kind of always stuck with me, and it's something to think about if you're trying to be authentic to the space that you're trying to create in sound design, is to pay attention to where you are in the world or in the globe and what kind of sounds you're hearing there. And if you're not sure, then you might have to take some time and do some research to see what that sounds like, or what those places are like. You know, I did some research into Medellin, and what, I've never been there, and about what the subways and what the cars were like. And I created a scene in Medellin, and our producer was like, that's not what the subway sounds like. And so he went out and recorded it. But, you know, I had no way of knowing in that instance. So like, it's important to kind of do your due diligence when you're sound designing, to make sure that you are being as authentic as possible in those moments.
And the authenticity was so important with the music as well, as you mentioned earlier, Genie, using the music from different decades as we went through the evolution of the story to make sure that the beats that we're hearing were accurate to where that music had evolved at the time.
Exactly. And I mean, that kind of leads us into our licensing and the commissions that we were able to do for the original music for the podcast. We worked with two composers, one that we actually commissioned specific sound-alikes in moments in time, that we just basically were like, here is X decade, year, la la la, make something that sounds like this. And he did that. And then we had another composer who just had a library of reggaeton, and he gave us rights to that library. So that was really helpful because it did create that authenticity to the music and the people who were listening and things like that. And especially since, you know, we weren't able to license everything. I mean, the artists and everything that you hear in the podcast that is an actual song was all licensed. And so, and if there was a song that we may have wanted to hear that we weren't able to, you know, being able to commission that music was helpful. And, you know, one instance, there in episode 6, there was a whole story built around one specific song that we weren't able to license in the end. So it kind of at the last minute came through that my husband and I produced music together that we were able to come up with a sound alike that at least gave you a vibe of what the original sounded like. And, you know, some of that is about, you know, changing up arpeggios so you don't run into copyright infringement. But again, like I mentioned with Dembow, it's the backbeat is the same and everything. So those were a few things that were kind of that, you know, issues that we ran into, but also that was kind of fun to play around with. I'm just going to open up another session here, another episode. While I do this, is there anything else you want to mention about the licensing, Stephanie?
We also used one of the production music libraries that we used, Universal Production Music, has a very cool feature called similarity search. And that's something that we utilized quite a bit if we wanted to have something with a particular beat but couldn't get the licensing for it. It was a cool trick to upload that into their system, try to find something with a similar vibe, and then use some of those options. I have an example here if you'd like me to jump into that, Genie.
Cool. So like if as she was showing in the video, there you know, you just put the link in and it analyzes a portion of the beat and then it finds you something that's similar. So, you know, one of the biggest hits before Despacito in like 2005 was Gasolina, which that was the sound alike she just pulled up there. So those kind of things were super important, and you know, a lot of music libraries are now super helpful with that kind of stuff. I'm going to play you another little snippet from episode 3 here, which was a trick I did with the Dembow beat. Let me just share sound. I mean, stereo, you're going to need stereo for this. All right. So this is the famous, infamous, however you want to think about it, Dembow beat.
Dembow, 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 dembow. And over time, that beat from that one song.
All right. So again, that's just a boom, that boom, that boom. Yeah. That's the beat you're going to hear on a million different songs. So something I did here when we were trying to break down to people the insanity of how Dembow has kind of taken over our lives, and also to make you kind of like feel the insanity of the fact that Dembow is everywhere, was that I just had everything overlap here. So here we go.
That beat from that one song transformed into the basis for thousands and thousands of reggaeton songs, to the point where it's become the sound of the genre.
That's still the sound that people can identify reggaeton.
El dembow de la raza, la cultura.
Cool. So basically, I hope that it was still in stereo on Facebook, but what I did was I took each of these songs and I tempo matched them. and I panned them hard right and left and had them coming at you at different moments and times. But the beats were all the same because the backbone of the songs are all the same. And if you don't know this trick in Pro Tools, you can highlight your tempo here in the MIDI controls and select once you hit play,
Transform into the basis for thousands and thousands of reggaeton songs. Transform into the basis for thousands and thousands of reggaeton.
So it might not be completely accurate. It's usually easier if you have a little bit more lead up time there, but that's just a trick if you need to do something like that. It's an easy way to figure out what the tempo is, and then you can, in this scenario, I would use the audio suite time compression expansion, and then I would put in the tempo that it was and then where it needed to go, and then that was it. And then at that point, you know, this one is not completely exactly on it, but you know, you can see where they line up, and then it's just very easy to kind of have them all happening at the moment that they're happening. So a lot of those kind of little things about trying to find ways to be creative to kind of help you feel the momentum and the insanity of like I said, dembow is kind of everywhere at this moment, and everyone wants to do dembow tracks. Stephanie, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the differences in the mix process for this podcast, especially since there was so much music. So do you want to kind of dig into that a little bit?
Sure, Jeannie. So yeah, I mean, I create a template for every podcast I work on to keep sessions organized by type of audio. So every template has tracks for narration, in studio recordings, voice memo, Zoom. You know, we're getting a lot of interviews like that these days. Field sound music, ambient effects, and so on. And so that was similar in this case in that, you know, I started with a template, and then once we mixed the first episode and we had, you know, good processing for Evie Queen's tracks, we kind of knew what the show overall, what the workflow was going to need. We were able to use that template to then build the other episodes. And so that was really helpful. And what was different? So I had to take a slightly different mix approach when mixing loud. So I work on a lot of public radio. So for narrative stories for public radio, the main objective, like you said earlier, Jeannie, is that the narration and the voices are really front and center. And usually when you're working with music beds and other sound design, it's slightly more of a texture or giving more of a supportive role. But with loud, the music was one of the main characters. So there was a balance there with carving out the space for the intelligibility of the narration and interviews, while also making sure that the energy of the music was still extremely present. You know, we left those spaces for the music. And I also approached the mix on loud with immersive imagery in mind. So while I did consistently stay on our target of -16 LUFS, which is, you know, our standard in-house, I took a few liberties with certain elements having more dynamic range than I normally would on a podcast mix for effect. And I can show you an example. I have to screen share again. There's one scene where you're immersed in the sound of a club and suddenly police break down the door. 1 second, gonna screen share.
So he starts to play music.
Everybody having a good time. De momento, boom! Policía de Puerto Rico. That's what happened right here.
It was the police. After hitting the stores, now they decide to raid the clubs.
So you'll notice in that spot, that door slam was loud, and it was meant to be, you know, loud, pun intended. But you know, we wanted it to be jarring. We wanted it to be shocking because we wanted you to be immersed in that scene and then really be shocked when that door slammed. And we did that as well with the music. There are a few intentional spots where you'll find that the music rides a little bit high. We added some extra distortion, and I'd love to show an example of that as well.
And of course, big ass speakers.
So everybody had these big equipments in the bus, and it was like you're having a party in a bus.
Yeah, man.
But you want it to be.
So as you can see, we were kind of slamming it there. We really wanted that effect of like busted out speakers on a bus. And I love that scene as well. The buses kind of take on a character of their own. The sound design in those parts of those episodes, it's really fun to feel like you're on that bus, to have that music blasting, to hear the crowd sound that's mixed in as well.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is like also, I mean, in Latin America, thinking of how, I mean, people get away with a lot in terms of the buses. So the buses are super loud, the mufflers and the rattle, and like there's so much to consider when in those moments. So like Stephanie mentioned, a lot of moments that we rode the music high, and I mean part of that is because this is a dance music, it's a dance culture, and it's fun. So if you're listening to a podcast about something, it was important for us to have that bumping happening. And I remember the first mix we came through, I came back, the first thing I said was like, we need more bump in the music, like, so we got to have more bass. Like it's important as part of the story, because it's, you know, the music isn't taking a back seat in the story, like it is the story. So, you know, it was really cool to see how Stephanie kind of tied all that together, because, you know, once it left my hands, it was kind of like just waiting to see what would come back and stuff. So it was a really great team to kind of get all that together, and see how, you know, all of the workflow at the end of the day. You know, another thing that was interesting is in the end, all of this happened post-pandemic. You know, like I said, our first trip was to Puerto Rico in December of 2019. And we originally had planned on, let's go to Panama, let's go to Colombia, let's go to all these places. And then, you know, the March of 2020 got shut down and everything changed. So the sessions and everything had to be shuttled back and forth, which was complicated because, you know, the pilot session, I tend, the projects that I worked on, always to use a lot of music. So the pilot sessions, I mean, we're talking about like huge file folders, like gigs and gigs upon gigs. There were 10 episodes. So we, you know, I'll let Stephanie talk a little bit more about how we implemented Google Drive, but basically it was just a matter of like, you know, making sure everything was where it needed to be so that we could shuttle these things back and forth, and that the next person could pick up where you left off. Stephanie, do you want to talk a little bit about the remote workflow?
Yeah, so yeah, like you mentioned, the sessions were rather large to accommodate for all the sound effects and music and the 24/48 recordings. And so it was really important for us to plan ahead in the workflow to make sure that we uploaded the files at night. So that was kind of our, so in the morning we sat down, we had everything. So there was a lot of teamwork there, and we used G Drive, specifically the G Drive desktop client, which is really effective for passing Pro Tools sessions back and forth. The organization was so important. The file naming conventions, making sure that everything had an audio elements folder for all of the raw interviews, all of the music, as well as Pro Tools sessions folders that were organized, had again those naming conventions that were spot on, and bounce folders so that we had the stems, everything that we had to deliver for QC. So that was all really important to stick to. And also, so our sessions were organized so that they were all bused to auxes for the eventual delivery of stems. That was really helpful down the line as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the most important things when you're working with sessions of this size is auxes, because, I mean, you know, every episode had, I don't know how many VO, different interviews, tons and tons and layers upon layers of sound effects. Because I mean, when you're doing anything, I mean, as most of you know, if you work in sound design, you're just going to have lots of different tracks with lots of different sound effects. So all of that starts to pile up, and it can become very difficult to manage if you are just kind of like trying to individually manage everything. But you know, once you have everything organized in your session to go to specific auxes, it becomes a little bit easier to manage all of the VO, and things like that. The only traveling that did happen was recording the host, Evie Queen. who was in Miami. Our executive producer Marlon Bishop and the our other senior producer Luis Gallo went to Miami every time to track her. If you are worried that you won't understand this podcast is actually in English, and it was planned that way, and the English is not Evie Queen's first language, but she speaks it great. But the podcast ended up taking on kind of a bilingual approach, kind of haphazardly and kind of not, because that's the way Evie Queen speaks. So the producers were going there every time to help coach her through each of the scripts every week. They weren't traveling every week. They would go every couple of months and then track several scripts at a time. But it was really important, especially because, a first and a breakthrough for a lot of people to be able to hear things going in both languages. And if you are an only English speaker, it was very easy to obviously follow along everything because it's very easy to understand. And I've had actually a lot of Spanish speakers, because of the pacing of the way that things were laid out in the project, are able to also follow along because it was a very seamless integration on how the language would work. So you don't always have to speak the language that's being heard, but you're able to understand what's going on in the podcast. And I thought that was something that was really well done. The other thing is I don't know, do you have anything else, Stephanie, about the
I love the authenticity that Evie brought to the project, as well as, one of the, I think only females in the genre, one of the, main voices there. It was so wonderful working with her.
Yeah, especially in the beginning, because now you have a couple of women, but like to have her as a pioneer, it was very important for us to have a woman host because, I mean, the reggaeton world is very much a boys' club. So it was nice, excuse me, to have her narrate all of these voices and these things and bring around a level of authenticity and honesty to a genre that hasn't always been very favorable towards women. So it was a great conversation to have as well throughout the project. Any favorites, Stephanie?
Well, I loved working with the immersive sound design. That's always, my favorite thing to do working on these projects. I've loved seeing the positive response that everyone's had. And I think my favorite thing about working on the project was listening to all of the amazing music while I was mixing.
Yeah, that was great for me too. I really enjoyed the music. I mean, like I said, I kind of grew up with this, so to me it was like taking a trip down memory lane through each decade of, not that many decades, but a few moments in history to kind of like relive these moments of when there were these big breakthroughs in reggaeton and stuff. Was really exciting to kind of like go back through. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will address them to the best of our ability. You see. For me, I think in terms of any surprises or maybe challenges that we had during this podcast, like I mentioned, I had a baby in the middle of this. So for me, there was a lot of a kind of a moment where I had to let go of the control, because having started from the beginning and having wanted to really be involved with as many processes as possible, it was impossible. There was just too much going on personally. And at some point you just kind of have to let go of the responsibilities and trust your team. And knowing that we had a really good team made it a little bit easier. But whereas I used to be like, when you're sound designing something, it tends to be your baby. Like you really take hold of that. And I think at some point, what we all as creatives have to let go of that control when it's going through edits, when it's going through notes, when it's coming from feedback where your executive producer is like, I don't like this song, switch it out. And you may have spent all this time editing the song to hit in certain spots the way you want it to hit. So that kind of stuff is hard, but I think it's important to be open to that. And I think it was really important the way we set up our, at one point, I was in like episode 1 or 2 or 3, and I was like, oh, right, there's 10 episodes more to sound design, and I am only on episode 2. So at some point, like, things clicked, and I was like, all right, this is coming out of my hands, and I have to be okay with the fact that it's going to a very capable person, and any changes that need to happen, it just kind of needs to, any changes will be handled with a capable person. Let me see here. Seeing about questions. Okay. So yeah, if we don't have any more, anything else, Stephanie, what about challenges for you?
One challenging thing with the licensing was, we wanted to bring in as many of the artists as we could. So sometimes that meant waiting until the very last day before the episode aired to see if that licensing would go through and we could get that approval. And so what that would mean in certain cases is that we would have 2 versions of some of the episodes. One with a sound alike that was timed, perfectly mixed, QC'd, and another with the actual song. And so sometimes it was that waiting of like to the last minute. It's like, okay, we have to upload in a few minutes. Did we get it? All right, no, we didn't get it. We did get it. Upload that one. So an exciting part of the process.
Yeah, a lot of stuff coming through at the final moments there for sure. I'm trying to think of anything else here. Let's see.
And Jeannie, the timeline for the project.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
How long you worked on it beforehand, and then how long we had to mix?
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So the pilot process was, we had a couple of months to work on that, and once that got greenlit, we had a little lag in waiting on the green light. Once we got greenlit, we had a larger team. The production timeline was quick, but we had enough time to kind of work on it. So like once we got to building each episode, again, this is part of the like assembly line process that was really great in terms of how we operated. Was, at one point I had producers shelling the episode, which is what we call just putting the voices together. So we have the narrator with each of the guests, and then I would come to me to do all of the sound design. So once, I don't know, I would have maybe 1 or 2 weeks to work on one episode, and then it would go through a round of notes, and then it would come back to me, and I would change anything that like needed to, that was since I was the person kind of in charge of like what moment in time we were in, then after that round of notes, then it would go to Stephanie. And Stephanie, you had, how long did you have for each episode to mix, I think?
Depending on the episode, about a week and a half.
So some of that changed towards the end when we had more time at the beginning when we started the project. But I guess we started at the beginning of the year. I started sound dicing when I came back after maternity leave, April 1st, I think. And we launched episodes. Did we do 1 and 2 together? I think we did episodes 1 and 2 together. We launched in August, right? Yeah, August. August was the first episode. August 3rd came out the first episode. So that's a few months for that. And we weren't complete. We weren't done with all 10 episodes on August 3rd. So we had maybe at least 4 or 5 episodes kind of like in a decent place, and then as we went, that's why the timeline got quicker towards the end, and we were kind of rushing at the end. But we did have plenty of time though. If you have questions, because of the way we're streaming this, we may not see them right now, but if you would please drop them in the chat if you watch this later. We will come back and we will answer your questions as to the best of our ability. Stephanie, do you have anything else you want to share?
Just that it was so amazing to work on the show and to work with you, Genie, and the entire team. Such an amazing group of people, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I'm looking forward to checking out these questions.
Awesome. We have a few more minutes. I'm not sure if we should, maybe we can show a little bit. I'll pop into another Pro Tool session here. There was a club in Puerto Rico called The Noise, which is episode 3, / which was the pilot. So there's a lot of sound design in this that kind of like bled from the pilot, which was nice. But I'm just going to play a little bit here.
San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's 1991.
En Puerto Rico no hay un plan completo para proteger la seguridad de tu familia.
On the edge of the old city, there's this little club. It got a huge line outside. The music is bumping. Inside, the place is dark. No lights at all. Cloudy with weed smoke. Sweat dripping from the ceiling. The bass is pumping. Flat tops on the guys, braids on the girls, baggy jeans on both. Las chicas perreando, grinding their asses up against the guys, hands on the floor. Yo, people out going wild. Honey, this is the noise.
So something that we found that I started kind of hoarding and recreating everything is, it's one thing to find crowd noise in Spanish. So we kept this low, but the Puerto Rican accent is very different from that. So we had some ambi that we recorded in Puerto Rico on the first trip that you'll hear here. So we tried to keep that a little bit louder than the other ambi we're hearing, so that you could get the feeling that you were in the club, but that, you know, that you could hear the accent of Puerto Rico popping out more. So those are kind of the touches that we were talking about, trying to maintain it authentic to the space and the place that you were in. Because otherwise then, you know, it's any space and time, but you know, you wanted it to be important that you were in Puerto Rico and not any random Spanish country. Do you want to add anything, Stephanie, about the mix of that section?
One thing about the sound design and mix in sections that had a lot of layers like that, one important thing to do was to nudge the VO so that you could let those windows kind of come through in those moments. So thinking about what the person said, stopping strategically as they made points to kind of space them out in certain points, so that you could have those windows, the sound design or the music, come up and shine in those moments, as well as kind of accent what the person had just said.
Yeah, exactly. Creating those windows in time so that those things would become their own characters and like you said, Stephanie, shine. Cool. So I think that we've kind of gone all the way around the block with this podcast. Again, if you have questions of anything that you've seen or you've heard the podcast and you want to know more, feel free to drop questions in the comments and we'll come back and look at them and answer as much as we can. You can also find us on social media. I'm at JMO That's JMO Sound. And Stephanie, you want to give your info?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, Steph Lebow, STEFLEBAUX.
Awesome, and I want to thank you all for being with us. We have more fun AES panels ready for you. We will be dropping the dates, so pay attention to your AES New York City Facebook feed for more information about the panels coming up. We hope you all have a joyous holiday season and New Year's, and we will be in touch soon. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day.